G'day and welcome to the channel. In today's video, I'm going to share with you how you can take control of your exposure using manual mode to get the correct exposure when you're photographing wildlife. So I'm going to cover why you'd even want to shoot in manual, what are the key concepts to understanding getting good exposure. I'm going to share with you the 5 steps that I use every time I set an exposure. And I'm going to go out into the field and I'm going to use my R5 mirrorless body. I'm also going to pull out my trusty old 40D, a 10 megapixel APS-C body. I also want to make it crystal clear that I'm not saying you have to shoot in manual mode or that manual mode is better. At the end of the day, our goal is to get a correct exposure, and you can get that using both manual mode and an auto exposure mode, and I'll be covering those today. So before I go out into the field, I think it's important that we cover a few key concepts and fundamentals about exposure, those being your light meter and your histogram. So let's start with the obvious question. Why would you even want to shoot in manual mode? Isn't auto exposure much easier? And yes, it is. And it gets it right the majority of the time. But the issue is sometimes these really smart cameras just get it wrong. They completely stuff up the exposure. You can see this black kite image, it's far too dark, and this albatross image, it's far too bright. Right, to understand why your camera gets it wrong, it's all due to the meter that the camera has. So the meter in the camera, when we look down the viewfinder, we're looking at a certain scene. That scene is reflecting light back into the meter, and the meter is taking an average reading of the brightness of that scene. And the camera doesn't want it too bright, it doesn't want it too dark, it wants it bang in the middle. It wants an average middle grey. So that's all the camera's calibrated to do, is achieve middle grey, you know, the average brightness. So when we look at that black kite image, the image that the camera has taken, middle grey, is actually too dark. And that's because the sky is so bright that it's trying to dark it out. So the actual scene is brighter than middle grey, but the camera has reduced it down to middle grey, which has made it darker. The correct exposure is actually brighter than middle grey, and that's what we want. With the albatross image, the average scene was too dark because of that blue water. So the camera's gone, well, we're below middle grey, we're too dark, so let's brighten the image up until it's middle grey. By doing that, the whites on the bird are now completely blown and that exposure is wrong. The camera's meter can't meter that scene. It has to be darker than middle grey so we don't blow the whites. Also important to know that your meter has a few different ways that it averages the reflected light. Majority of us use what's called evaluative metering. That's when we take a reading of the entire scene, but we put more emphasis on where the focus points are. What might be easiest is if I just do a little demonstration for you using my mate Gary the Galah. So I took Gary the Galah and I placed him behind a black background. I've adjusted the exposure in manual mode to what I would call a correct exposure. When we look at the meter, it is actually telling us that the scene is darker than middle grey. That bar is to the left of middle grey. It's saying it's too dark. So as you can imagine, when we put it into auto ISO or auto exposure, the camera's going to brighten that scene and put the bar under middle grey. And of course now Gary the Galah is completely blown. Now if we flip that card over and we use a white card, the scene is now really bright, and we can see on the meter there, the meter's gone well past middle grey. It's saying this image is just way too bright. So again, as you can guess, if we put it into auto exposure mode, it's going to take us to middle grey. It's going to make the whole image much darker, and the entire image now is underexposed. And Gary's quite dark, the white is now grey. So as you can see, the camera's default auto exposure mode without any correction can get things wrong, especially in those scenarios with either dark or bright backgrounds and white birds. So it's important we understand what's going on there so that we can correct it ourselves. So the next question is, well, how do we know what is a good exposure? And thankfully our cameras have a tool built into them which tells us when we've got the exposure right, and that's called the histogram. Now you can see the histogram either on the LCD after you've taken a photo on a DSLR, or if you've got a mirrorless body, you can actually see the histogram through the viewfinder or in live mode on the back of the LCD. And it's a very handy tool. So we need to know how to read this histogram so we can use the right settings to get the right exposure. So how a histogram actually works is it actually turns your image into black and white, and it plots all the pixels onto a graph in 256 brightness levels. So we go from pure black on the left to pure white on the right, and the pixels will populate that graph depending on the brightness of your scene. So if we have a look at our albatross image, and this is the exposure that it got wrong, and we can see how bright those whites are, and the water is quite dark. Now the camera looks at every single pixel and places it on a graph from pure black to pure white. The result is our histogram, which you can see overlaid on the image. There's lots of very dark pixels, which is the water, and lots of very light pixels, which is the white bird. So the average of all these pixels is middle grey, and the actual shape of the histogram is completely irrelevant. It's just going to plot what it's seeing. Now, what this histogram is showing us is something that we want to avoid at all costs, and that's lots of pixels on the right-hand side. What that means is if we have lots of pixels hitting that right-hand edge of the histogram, it means our whites are blown. It means we don't have any detail on our whites whatsoever. So what we want to do is darken the image so that those white pixels are no longer touching the right-hand edge. So this is often referred to as exposing to the right, and by doing this you have the least amount of noise, the best tonal range, and generally the best quality images by doing this. So let's take a look at our black kite image. We're going to overlay the histogram, and as you can see we've got a few very dark pixels which are under the wing of the bird, but the majority of the pixels are kind of in that middle grey already, which is the sky. So the camera is just a little bit too dark. We don't have any pixels on the right hand side of our histogram, therefore it's telling me that the image is too dark. So what we need to do is intentionally go brighter than middle grey, and by doing that we're going to shift those pixels to the right hand side, and now we have a much better exposure. We can see that the kite looks correct to me. We don't want those pixels touching the right hand side, especially if we don't have any white pixels, because that will be overexposed. All we're trying to do is just shift our pixels to the right without them hitting that right hand side. We don't want them all backed up to the left hand side of the image, because then it's going to be too dark. And that's all we're doing. It's actually quite simple. All we're doing when we're setting our exposure is trying to get the bright pixels to the right without hitting the right hand side. And that's all we're trying to do. I guess the only thing I should note is just be aware that your histogram and your viewfinder and on the back of the picture is actually going off the JPEG, and your RAW file will have a lot more data, a lot more dynamic range, and you'll be surprised just how much you can recover in your RAW file compared to the histogram that you see on your camera. I'm sure you would have heard me use the term blinkies before. All that is an overexposure warning or a highlight warning on your camera. So when you take a photo and you review it on the back of the camera, if the whites are blown or you've got pixels hitting that right-hand edge, they're going to flash at you on the back of the camera. And this is really useful for when you check your image. If it's flashing at you, clearly your whites are hitting the right-hand side, so you need to darken the image to stop it from flashing. So look, there'll be a setting in your camera to turn on the highlight exposure warning. I highly encourage that you do this because it's going to assist you finding the right settings in manual mode. All right, so now we know how to read our meter, we know how to read our histogram. How do we choose our settings to get a correct exposure? I know this is difficult, but bear with me. The key concept to understand: when you take a photo, there's only a certain amount of ambient light available. So I've created this chart which shows you the different scenes you might encounter and the typical settings I would use. So as we can see, we've got dark, which is your low light, we've got medium, which is overcast and shade, and then we've got bright, that's direct sunlight. Now the bright setting, as you can see, leads to the lowest ISO and the highest shutter speeds. This is when you get the very best detail. But when we look in the dark scene, that's your rainforests and your forests or before the sun comes up, we don't have a lot of light. Therefore, we have to use low shutter speeds or high ISO. When you shoot in low light, just be prepared that you are going to have noise, you are going to have blurry photos. It's just part of life. You have to deal with it and expect it. So I now want to outline the 5 steps that I follow every time I set my exposure. And just to make things a little bit confusing, there's 2 actual ways to do this. We can either adjust our shutter speed or adjust our ISO, and I'll go through both of them, and either of them is completely fine. First step, and I do this all the time, is I assess how much ambient light I have available. So I have either dark, medium or bright. That's going to determine the next step and the settings that I use. The second step is my aperture. I need to set how much light I'm letting into the lens. Now, depending on your brightness level, if it's really, really dark, I'm going to shoot wide open. Wide open is basically the maximum size your aperture can go to let the light in. This lens here, because I've got a 1.4 converter on, the maximum aperture is 5.6. So I would set the aperture at 5.6 in the dark scene to let in the most amount of light. However, if I'm in a medium brightness, I can actually stop that down a little bit. I would go to say 7.1. Why would I do that? Well, when you stop down your lens, it generally makes it a little bit sharper and your depth of field increases. So 7.1 is what I go for medium. And for bright, I'm likely to go to between f8 and f10, depending on how close I am, just to, again, increase that sharpness. So once my aperture is set, I really don't change it. I sort of just leave that alone. And so my aperture is now set. Now the second thing I need to set when I'm shooting in this shutter speed mode is my ISO. I need to determine what ISO is right for the shutter speed that I need. And that's going to largely depend on the scene you're photographing, because you're going to need a different shutter speed depending if the bird's static, action or bird in flight. So your ISO will determine a lot of the shutter speeds that you're able to use. Let's just say we're shooting static birds. So for static birds with a modern camera like this R5, in dark scenes, I'm going to start with a fairly high ISO of say 3200. That's going to allow us to have slightly higher shutter speeds. In medium, I'd start with ISO 1600, and then for bright conditions, I'm going to start at ISO 800. I know those might sound a little bit high to you, but I generally go on the slightly higher side so that I can have higher shutter speeds. If I've got an old camera like this 40D, those ISO levels are probably just too high. So I probably need to halve all that. So for dark, 16, for medium, 800, for bright, 400. That's sort of the settings I would use for an old camera, or if you struggle with noise. So now that our aperture is set, our ISO is set, we now need to get our shutter speed. And our shutter speed is the thing that floats. Our shutter speed is what I'm going to change when the light changes. And to get the right shutter speed, I need to use the meter and the blinkies and the histogram. And so luckily on this mirrorless body, I can actually have a live histogram and a live exposure. So I just look through the viewfinder, and I just turn the shutter speed until it's right in the camera. So if the scene's too bright, I just turn the shutter speed to the right, which obviously increases our shutter speed. And if I want to go lighter or brighter, I decrease the shutter speed, I go left. So that's all I'm doing in this mode. Now, I need to check my shutter speed once I've got the correct exposure. So I'll look at it. If my shutter speed's way too low, like say my shutter speed is 200th of a second, that tells me that I need to increase my ISO. So I need to double my ISO, and then that allows me to double my shutter speed. So there's this constant battle between shutter speed and ISO, and that's all it comes down to really, is you need to make a choice of what you're comfortable with your ISO setting and your shutter speed setting. Remember, low shutter speeds equal blurry shots, soft shots, whereas high ISO means slightly more noise. And that's just something you have to come up with yourself. All right, so the next method, and this is probably a far more popular way to do it, is again, we'll go through the 5-step process. This is what we call the ISO mode. So what we do is we check the ambient light again, dark, medium, bright. We set the aperture exactly the same. So wide open for dark, 7.1 for medium, f8 to 10 for bright. So those two steps are the same. The third step is where we change. So in the previous step, we set the ISO. This time, we're going to set the shutter speed. We're going to fix the shutter speed. And this is pretty difficult because we need to know, well, what shutter speed do we need to freeze the action? And this can be a little bit tricky because you have to understand that if you've got bird in flight, you're going to need above 1600th of a second. Above 2000 would be better. If you're shooting some sort of action like ducks' wings going or whatever, ideally you want to be over 1000th of a second. If you've got static birds, then you can shoot a lot slower. So what type of subjects are you shooting? It's going to dictate the shutter speed that you set. Let's just say that we're shooting static birds. So the birds aren't moving, so we don't have to worry as much about motion blur. So what I would do in the dark setting, I would probably start at 320, 400th of a second. For medium brightness, probably 640th of a second. And then if we've got nice bright light, you can set it at 1000 or 1250th of a second. Those are the shutter speeds that I would set. So now that we've set our shutter speed, we need to adjust our ISO until the exposure is correct. Now we can let the camera do this by putting it into auto ISO. If we do that, the camera is just going to change the ISO until we get to middle grey. Now if we want to tell the camera to go slightly brighter or darker in auto exposure mode, we need to use exposure compensation. Now again, look in your camera manual on how you do this, but exposure compensation, all we're doing is brightening the image from middle grey or darkening the image, and this allows us to take control. So in auto ISO, you need to use exposure compensation to override the camera's meter. Now if you're still in full manual mode, we don't have to worry about exposure compensation. We just use the meter to tell us when we're getting to middle grey, and then we just change the dial. We change the ISO dial, we either brighten it or darken it until it's right in the viewfinder. And look, I know this is confusing, but this will come to you with time. It'll come with you with experience. You just have to get out there, give it a go, fail, learn from your failings, and just try and try again. So what I think might be worthwhile is, instead of me continually talking about all this theory and confusing you, why don't I go out into the field and just put these things into practice, and I'll show you step by step how I do it, the exposure we get, the shots we get, what the histogram looks like in those shots. So let's head out into the field now and have a go. Okay, so we're in the field and I need to set my exposure. First thing we do, what's the ambient light like? it's currently very, very overcast. We've just had rain, so I need to be aware of that. So I'm going to set my aperture first, and because this is quite a fast lens, I'm going to go at 7.1 because that's going to give me the sharpest possible image in these conditions. So let's just change the aperture. I've got the aperture on the top dial on the R5, so I go to 7.1. So we're now at 7.1. Next thing I need to do is I need to set the ISO. Because we're in medium, I'm going to go with ISO 1600, and I have the ISO just on the back dial, so I can just change it to 1600. And now we can see my image is extremely bright. It's overexposed. We've got the whites hitting the right-hand side of that histogram. So the beauty of these mirrorless bodies is the exposure is live in the viewfinder. So this monitor here is just showing me what I'd be seeing in the viewfinder. At the moment, it's very, very bright, and we can see all the pixels hitting the right-hand side. It's overexposed. And I can even tell just by looking at it, that's far, far too bright. So I need to darken this image. I need to make it darker so we can not overexpose. And all I have to do in manual mode is now I've set my aperture and my ISO. The only other thing I need to change is my shutter speed. And for me, I have my shutter speed on this front dial. Other people have it on the back dial. You can have it wherever you want. And in my brain to remember, all I know is right is dark, left is bright. So if this is too bright and I want to make it darker, I just turn it to the right, and this is changing our shutter speed. And we can see as I turn the dial, it's getting darker. I can keep an eye on that histogram until it's no longer touching the right-hand side. And now it's no longer touching. And I can see that my shutter speed is now 6/40th of a second, which is fast enough should a bird come and land on one of these perches here. So at the moment, I'm looking at my exposure and I'm pretty happy. ISO 1600, 7.1, and 6/40th of a second. But it's probably worth showing you here that we can see how the histogram will change based on the scene we're looking at. At the moment, we're looking at this rock. It's got some white moss on it, so that's reflecting a bit more light. And as we move it around and we can see the different perches, our histogram changes. So in this light here, it's actually too dark. So I would light, so I need to go left. So I just go left a couple of notches, and now we're looking at much, much better. All I'm doing really is eyeing the viewfinder, eyeing the histogram, and just moving this shutter speed dial. I guess the other thing worth mentioning is you've got to be careful if you are setting an exposure for a scene if the white bird's not in it, because we really need to set the exposure for the whites. And at the moment, I don't have a white bird here. All I've got is a background and a perch. If a white bird was to land on this, perhaps it would be too bright. So if you're expecting a white bird, sometimes what I'll do is I'll just make it a little bit darker, just in case. Okay, so the red cap's coming. I've just spotted the red cap. He's up in a tree over here. The red cap's gonna land here. Our exposure's set, we're good to go. We just gotta wait for the bird to land now, focus on it, get some shots. So I'm just waiting for it. I don't know exactly where it's gonna land. It's coming. Oh, he's gone up into the tree above us. So he's probably gonna come down and land on one of these wooden perches. So I'm just gonna be pre-focused in roughly the area, so when he lands, I'm good to go. Here he goes. He's on the ground. Just waiting for him to look at us, check the exposure. Exposure's fine. Oh, nice over the shoulder pose. Oh, look at that. That's just taking some shots, using the auto IAF to lock onto the eye. It's quite a nice setting on the green moss. Such a beautiful little bird. He's up on the perch and we're just checking the histogram. Histogram's not touching, so our whites should not be blowing. 400th of a second is a little bit slow, so if I wanted to bump up that shutter speed, I just increase the ISO, increase the shutter speed, and now we're at 800th of a second, which is pretty good. There we go, nice eye contact. Oh, beautiful pose. So we just had this bird. Oh, it's a nice over the shoulder pose. The histogram's fine. So if we look at the exposure indicator, we're actually past middle grey. We're actually brighter than middle grey, but that gives us the correct exposure. Oh, lovely, beautiful. So as the birds were just jumping around, I've constantly got my eye on the histogram. I'm constantly looking at how bright it is, and I'm just using that shutter speed, right, dark, left, bright. That's all I'm doing. Alrighty, so the other mode I want to try out today is manual plus auto ISO. That's not actually full manual, that is an auto exposure mode. So the camera is choosing the exposure for us, it's trying to get us to middle grey. But in auto ISO mode, what we do is we set the aperture, we set the shutter speed, and then the camera changes the ISO for us. So let's do that together. We're still obviously overcast, step one. Step two, we need to set our aperture. So again, I'm gonna go at 7.1 because it gives us a nice sharp shot. So I've set 7.1. Now I need to determine my shutter speed. And this is probably the trickiest part, is what shutter speed is gonna give me the best ISO or lowest ISO if you're worried about noise. For me here in these conditions here, let's say 500th of a second. Let's say we want 500th of a second as a minimum to get us some nice sharp shots. So I dial in 500th of a second, that's set. So I'm not going to really change those two settings now. I've set the aperture, I've set the shutter speed. The camera is now going to change the ISO based on the light in the meter. So now on the screen you can see when I try to expose this shot, we're going to middle grey. And I can tell already that it's just too dark. If we look at the histogram, we don't have any pixels in that right-hand side. So we need to brighten this image up somehow, but I can't because the camera is just going to override me. When I change the shutter speed or the aperture, the histogram stays exactly the same. And that's because the camera is always going to middle grey, as we discussed earlier. So I need a way to override the camera. I need a way to brighten or darken this image. And that's where exposure compensation comes into play. With exposure compensation, we can actually override the meter. So instead of the meter being middle grey, we can say we always want it slightly brighter or we want it slightly darker. And in this situation here, I want it brighter. So we need to adjust it. And every camera and every system will be different how you do your exposure compensation. On my R5, I've got it set up a little bit weird. The far right-hand button, if I hold that down and then I turn the top dial, that will change the exposure compensation. So as I mentioned, we're now middle grey, it's too dark. I hold down the right-hand side button and now I turn the right-hand side dial here. You can see how we've got an exposure compensation little graphics just popped up. And if I keep turning to the right, you can see it's getting brighter. We're now 2/3 of a stop brighter than middle grey. And we can see that on the level indicator here, that it's close to that number 1. So the 1 stands for 1 stop. So I can check my histogram now and it's looking pretty good. So I take it off and now whenever I do anything, whenever I move or change, the camera is always keeping that brightness. It's always keeping the 2/3 brighter than middle grey. A little bit confusing, but you can just think of your exposure compensation as a brightness darkness tool. So just by changing it, we go brighter or darker. You just need to be aware that when you do that, it's going to change your ISO. So when we were at middle grey, which we're at here, ISO was 1600. So when I brighten it to get a brighter image, it's obviously going to increase the ISO. So the ISO is now 2500. So you just need to be aware as you're dialing and adjusting your exposure compensation, something has to change to make it brighter or darker and your ISO is going to change. So I'm currently in auto ISO mode, shutter speed set to 500th, aperture set to 7.1 and our auto ISO is on. I've got my exposure right now. I just need a bird. Oh, the bird's back. Oh, I missed it. There we go. Oh, beautiful. Just check the exposure. It looks fantastic. Alrighty, so I've shot in manual mode, we've shot in auto ISO mode, we've managed to get the correct exposure and get some nice shots. Many of you are probably saying, well, Duade, I can't afford an R5, I've got an old body. Can you show me how to get the lowest noise possible with an old body? Well, I have my trusty old 40D, this old 10 megapixel beast. What is it, 13 years old now? Doesn't handle ISO very well. So why don't we put this on the big lens and try and set the exposure on this to get the lowest amount of noise possible for the given conditions. So let's do that now. All right, after a short rain delay, we're back. I have to set the exposure on my old 40D. I'm going to start in manual mode, and what I need to do, like always, still overcast, so we need to set our aperture. Because I'm worried about noise on this old body, I might just shoot wide open, which is 5.6. Now, this is going to sacrifice a little bit of sharpness, but it's going to enable me to have a lower ISO. So let's set the aperture to 5.6. So the aperture is at 5.6. Next thing I need to set is the ISO. As mentioned, we've got an old body, so let's set it at ISO 400. Just have to remember how to do that. Okay, so it's now set at aperture 5.6, ISO at 400. Now, how do we know what shutter speed to set? I don't have a live histogram. I can't tell looking through the viewfinder because it's optical, it stays the same. So we need a way to help us get to the right exposure. And this is probably the hardest thing. When I started, I didn't know how to do this. We just used the exposure indicator on the back of the LCD here. So on the old 40D, you can see when I touch the meter, it's going to tell me how far away I am from middle grey. So remember, middle grey is what the camera wants to get to, and that's a great starting point. So all I need to do is change the shutter speed until the indicator is sitting under middle grey. So let's do that. So I'm now at middle grey. Oh, I've got a bird. I'll just take a photo, sorry. So I've just got a bird. Now I'm checking on the back of the screen and I'm just having a look, and it's probably a touch dark, so I need to lower that shutter speed. So just checking now how we're looking. Okay, nothing's flashing, exposure's pretty good there. I have noticed that my shutter speed is very low, 2/50th of a second. That's what you have to do to get that low ISO, is your shutter speed just gets really, really low, and 2/50th of a second is pretty slow, and I'll probably get a bit of motion blur. But if you want the lowest amount of noise, that's what you have to do. But to be fair, I reckon ISO 400 is probably, this camera can go higher than that. Okay, so I'm going to shoot at ISO 1600 on this old camera. Now in my favor, the ambient light, even though it's overcast, there's still plenty of light around. It's not like I'm in a rainforest, so I'm not going to get as much noise as I would if it was really dark or in rainforest, etc. So even at ISO 1600, I've actually got a little bit more to play with now. So I'm actually at ISO 1600 f8. I've stopped it down to increase sharpness, and I've actually got a shutter speed of 1600th of a second, so quite high. Just checking the exposure, and the exposure looks okay. High excitement. So I've managed to get a whole range of shots of the red-capped robin at ISO 1600, got a few at ISO 400. We can compare them, and all I'm doing, as I've mentioned numerous times, is I'm just taking the shots, checking the exposure, and away I go. All right, well, that was a lot of fun. Let me know in the comments which was your favorite image. Again, I'm always surprised with how well this old 40D performs. Oh, I guess it helps that I've got this beautiful lens, but it shows you that a 10 megapixel camera with $40 can still take nice images. All right, so that was a good demonstration, but we had nice even light then. The light wasn't changing. And some of you might want to know, well, how do I set the exposure when we go from bright to dark, bright to dark? Well, I just so happened to head out with my mate Brian to a local park where we encountered some yellow-billed spoonbills, which is a white bird. These birds were going in shadow into the bright, shadow bright. These are the hardest conditions in which to expose a photo, and it was a real challenge. Now I had my R5, I had my 500mm lens. I've seen where the birds were. I've clambered down the bank to try to get as low as I could. I couldn't quite get the angle I wanted, but that's as good as I was going to get. So the first thing I needed to check was, what was my ambient light like? Well, it was overcast at that time, so I had to go sort of with that medium brightness setting. So I set my aperture at 7.1, and then I had to set my ISO, and because I was in medium brightness, I went with 1600 ISO. Now I then adjusted my shutter speed, and my shutter speed turned out to be 12/50th of a second, which was pretty high. I wanted it high because these birds often flap their wings and they move around and they're feeding, and the higher that shutter speed, the less likely I am to get that sort of motion blur. So I managed to take a few shots whilst the bird was in the shadow, but it didn't take long before the bird just happened to wander out into direct sunlight. So as soon as those white feathers hit the sunlight, the bird just started glowing and was way overexposed. And I could tell instantly looking through the viewfinder. So I needed to do something. And as you saw, I just have my shutter speed on the top dial. So I just need to go to the right is dark, left is bright. This was obviously way too bright, so I needed to make the image darker. So I just turned my shutter speed dial until the whites stopped glowing and my histogram was in the right position, and I just started taking the photos. So quite simple, you know, I just looked down the viewfinder and just turn, it's good, bang, 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 start shooting. And I managed to get these really interesting shots that had the nice dark background, and it was quite creative. And you'll notice here in the viewfinder that because of my fixed focal length, I couldn't get the reflection of the bird. So I've actually taken a shot of the bird, a shot of the reflection. I've merged them in post, which has enabled me to get this shot showing the reflection. And I was pretty happy with how this shot turned out. Some of you may have observed there in the settings that my shutter speed had actually got up to 1/4000th of a second, which is just way too high. That's really high. I didn't need to shoot that high. Ideally, what I probably should have done is actually dropped my ISO from 1600 down to 400. That would have allowed me to have a shutter speed of maybe 1/1000th of a second, which should have still been high enough, but I would have had a much cleaner file. And look, if I'd been shooting in auto ISO mode, the camera would have done that for me, and I may have ended up with a cleaner file. And I think this just highlights that, you know, we're always learning. There's no single right way to do anything. Certain settings and certain methods will be better in some than others, and I think we ultimately stick to what we're comfortable with. I'm comfortable just turning the shutter speed, and ISO 1600 to me is fine with the R5, so it didn't really bother me, and I still got a really nice photo. But you know, at the end of the day, we just got to try these different modes and then just stick with what works for you. Stick with one which gives you the best exposure the majority of the time. And I just want to give you one more example of how the light changes and how your settings have to adapt to that. So I went to this lake. I got there really early before the sun had come up, and I spotted all these little red-capped plovers running around on the beach. And I love these birds, haven't photographed them in ages, so I just wanted to get started straight away before the sun even came up. And we had some nice color reflecting off the water, but because I had no light, I had to shoot pretty much wide open, and I was shooting with the 100 to 500 with a 1.4 converter, so my maximum aperture was f10, so I set f10. Next, I needed to set the ISO, and I knew that I did not have very much light at all, so I went with ISO 6400, which is reasonably high. Then I adjusted my shutter speed, and my shutter speed was 1/200th of a second, which is really slow. So I didn't have any light really, but I got into it, started photographing this beautiful little bird, and sure enough, I did manage to get a shot that I was happy with, and I really like the colors in this shot. But it didn't take long before the sun came up, and now we had direct sunlight hitting the bird. So I could just completely change my settings now. I think I then just stopped it down by a little bit. I think I went to f11, dropped my ISO down to 800, and that gave me a shutter speed of over 1/1000th of a second. So we can see same location, different light, same subject, we get completely different settings. So obviously reading the light and understanding the light is going to enable you to choose the right settings. And the only way we can get good at this is just by getting out there and doing it. I know all these concepts are difficult to grasp, but the more you get out in the field, the more familiar you become with your camera, the easier all this is going to become. So you can watch this video a couple of times, but I highly encourage you to just get out there and try what I've spoken about. Get some photos, maybe fail, go back, try again, and eventually things will start to click into place and you'll start to fully grasp the concepts of all your settings and how it all works. And it's actually a fun part of photography. I've really enjoyed this learning process. I started out in full auto. I then went to aperture priority, and then I figured out exposure compensation. And then I've been trying manual mode. So I've gone through the process. I've tried all these things. I've failed, I've learned, and over time, I'm still failing, but you know, I've got better at what I'm trying to do and getting those correct exposures. And I'm sure you will be able to do exactly the same thing. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. Obviously, give it a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you want to see more of these videos. Let me know if you like these educational type videos, and I'll make more of them in the future. Thanks again to the members that directly support the channel. And until the next video, take care and see you later. Because as we can see, we don't have any pixels on the right-hand side of our Instagram, and that's Instagram. We don't